Vous vous nommez, puis...
Yes, my name is Jean Salençon. Okay. First of all, I would to thank the lecturers for their very interesting lectures, and I would have a question about education. Simple question about the time scale. What is the time scale to assess the effectiveness of some kind of trial?
It depends what you're evaluating. So some programs are 12-week programs, even shorter. Some are whole year programs. One of the problems, though, is if you just evaluate an education program immediately at post-test, at the end of the program, you may find positive effects. But what we know quite commonly is that improvements in reading that may be found from a 12-week intervention or a whole year intervention, those improvements disappear over the second and third year. So without being sustained and without further interventions, many of the effects in education do sadly disappear. It's not something that can be cured. Underachievement or poor reading, you can't cure it with one silver bullet of an intervention. So to answer your question, you can find out whether something's working immediately. I would say that's still very important, because actually in a lot of the trials we've done, we found out that things are not working immediately. So that's important to know straight away. But in terms of a longer term follow-up, we need many more trials which actually follow up results over a longer period, because for the reasons I've said, we don't know whether these programs last beyond a year or so.
Merci. Alors, 1, 2, 3.
I'd like to thank you very much for this approach that you have presented, because you introduced in a very balanced and sensitive approach this issue, which is always difficult in the school and teacher context. My question is about the cost of making this kind of studies. For science education in France, we have because of the vision of Alain-Jacques Valron, we have started a very moderate approach on trying to understand the impact of some of our actions in primary school, at the end of primary school. But we have been scared by the cost of that. I mean, to have a 2-year program with about 250 teachers being followed in classrooms, the cost is €500,000. So, of course, if one compares with the cost of education, it's a tiny drop. But when you ask this money to carry the cost, this becomes very difficult. So what is your approach to this issue of cost? Should it go through benevolent people? Should it be funded through different methods? Of course, we don't have the equivalent of pharmaceutical firms there. That's my question.
Well, the costs of educational trials can be high. There's a trial that I'm leading. It's looking at a pro-social behaviour programme in primary schools. And the idea of this is called Roots of Empathy. And the idea is that if you can teach children early to develop their social emotional learning, to regulate their behaviour, to be more pro-social and to reduce their aggressive behaviour to others, that creates the right conditions that they can then learn. So there's a sort of a fair argument there. And we evaluated that in 74 primary schools. It was a cluster randomised controlled trial with 4 years of follow-up. But we were very fortunate to get funding from the National Institute for Health Research in the UK for that study, because it classified as public health. But that cost £700,000. So over €1 million, a lot of money. But that involved follow-up, it involved data collection from each individual child, and a very strong qualitative component. We did case studies in a whole range of schools looking at how the programme was applied in practice. So I think that's one end of costs. But another end, if we simply want to know the effects on core outcomes like reading scores, comprehension or mathematical skills, many trials can be done far, far more cheaply. Particularly if you don't need to have a sort of a qualitative evaluation, you simply need to get pre-test scores, you need to control the trial very carefully, but also then just to have sort of post-test scores from the children as well. And in developing our Centre for Effective Education in Northern Ireland, we did quite a few trials like that because we wanted to just develop the evidence base and to show that these things can be done. And to develop a sort of a framework to build upon. And some of those trials were fairly cheap. I mean, it depends. If you're talking to the public, the figures I'm going to tell you now are still seen as very costly compared to other things. But those types of trials could be anything from £50,000 to £100,000. And you can do a decent trial for that. But it's got to be limited. You're not going to have the follow-up potentially, and you're not going to have the sort of a detailed analysis of the programme itself sometimes. But the Education Endowment, now sources of funding, the Education Endowment Foundation in England is a charity funded through government, and they have about £25 million to spend on trials, particularly focused on trials to improve English literacy and numeracy. In England, we're based in Northern Ireland, so we can't do trials with their funding in Northern Ireland, but we are running about 8 trials in England from Northern Ireland because we have the expertise to do that. So there was a policy commitment at a very high level from government to say we actually do need more evidence. So they did actually move funding in that direction. The United States have done the same much earlier with the Institute for Education Sciences, and they have the What Works Clearinghouse. The interesting thing is what you do find then is that the number of trials, it does take political commitment at a high level, but you then have a huge resource. The What Works Clearinghouse in the United States is a whole reference and database of different types of educational approaches and the evidence in terms of their effectiveness and their cost. The Education Endowment Foundation have an educational toolkit which they're developing, which again has a whole list of different interventions which can happen within school, like peer tutoring, mentoring, sort of phonics, a whole range of different approaches to things. And for each one, it'll tell you what the average effect is and also what the average cost is, plus what's the nature of the evidence behind it. So there'll be some programs where you'll see at a glance, but there's not a lot of evidence behind this, but it's promising, or it's very costly. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but it does require, for the large, individual trials don't necessarily cost too much, but the commitment to do the number of trials that we need, given the number of questions we need to address, we do need high-level government commitment to be supporting and funding this type of work.
Nommez-vous, s'il vous plaît, Alain.
Alain Leplège from Paris Diderot University in Paris. I've enjoyed very much the 2 lectures, actually, and I would have had many questions, but I will restrict to 2 questions, one for each speaker. To Professor Connolly, why did you restrain to RCT, actually? Because, of course, if one refers to the famous Campbell and Stanley textbook, for example, published in the 50s, it's obvious that there are many more designs than RCT, which are available in educational studies and which would fit better, I guess, the need for many research questions. So you mentioned only RCT, which it seems to be fairly marginal type of methodology. And I think this is overlooked. Also, the possibility of doing quasi-experimental design, etc., is overlooked also in healthcare. When the focus on RCT is probably a mistake, and especially in health service research, I would say. Mm-hmm. And my question for Professor Ravaud is that when Professor Connolly presented a no-brainer example of the advantage of the Campbell and collaboration methodology, you didn't actually. Could you? Is there an example of meta-analysis which has made a difference with comparison to wishful thinking and common knowledge. So, yes, these are my two questions, actually.
I'll very briefly then, while I'm here, and I'll gladly sit down. In terms of why randomised trials, it does come back to the questions we're asking. So I'm not advocating trials need to be the only thing that we do in education research. But when we're interested particularly in effectiveness, what's the causes, what's the impact of a particular approach in education, you can't get better than a randomised trial. I mean, the logic is that to understand whether something's effective, you do need to measure children or pupils before and afterwards, so you need to see how they've changed. One of the common mistakes then is to do that without a control group. So you'll see that young children, you have reports saying young children really benefited from this programme because their reading scores or their motor skills developed over 6 months. But they're going to develop anyway because they're children. So we need a control group. The issue then is that control group needs to be matched. And we know time and again, and Philippe can talk to this, but we know that when we don't have randomisation, we will often have unmatched groups. And we certainly know from many meta-analyses that actually studies which use randomisation produce lower estimates of effects compared to those that don't use randomisation. In other words, when you don't use randomisation, you get inflated effects because of a whole range of reasons which you can't control for. And there was another part to the question, but I can't remember.
The second question was to Ravaud.
Yes. Could you rephrase your question? But I am not 100% sure to understand your question.
No, my question is, I understand and I agree, of course, with this Fisherian framework for doing research and doing empirical research, taking into account the statistics and the quantification of uncertainty, etc. But the point is about the meta-analysis. My question was, Professor Connolly provided an example of success of his methodology, and is there a typical case where you could say that a meta-analysis made a difference with comparison to common knowledge? When, for example, for RCT, of course, the comparison of the treatment of streptomycin made a difference.
Okay, perhaps I could use the logo of the Cochrane for that, because the logo of the Cochrane is about a first meta-analysis performed on corticosteroids for premature babies. And these corticosteroids were not used, but decreased the mortality of the babies by something like 20 or 30%. Therefore, it's why we use that for the logo of the Cochrane, and it was the first historical meta-analysis that make a big difference in terms of care of patients.
Merci. Valron, à la... Oui?
It's just a question for Paul. I'm returning on the question of Jean Salençon about time scale. In education, I think the real question we have is to know what will happen at the adult age. Will we prepare children to have good jobs, to be socially active, to be prepared to adult life? So my precise question is about time scale. I guess that to get information about that's more cohort studies than randomized trials that are possible. And do you have what is the longest study? The study with the longest endpoint that you are aware of.
Yeah.
And what do you think about this question?
Very good, and it also allows me to, the other bit I forgot to respond to my other colleague there was, there are different types of methods you can use. I think the key thing is that you can actually do trials in education. far more easily than people have said. So if you can do a trial, if you can randomise, that's important. There's some contexts where area-based interventions where you can't randomise them, but there are other methods then to use to get as close as you can to that process. And also there's the importance of other types of research, of sort of longitudinal studies. We've just started now a large-scale longitudinal study of young people at the start of secondary school at 11, and we're tracking them over time. We're also collecting a lot of information on what schools are doing in terms of policies, practices, procedures, interventions. So in real time we can look at changes of outcomes, how they develop, and whether there's an association between what schools do and those outcomes. That's not a proof of causality, but it will point us, hopefully, to very interesting areas for development. The longest trial I can think of in my own field in early childhood is the High Scope study, which goes back to the 1960s. And that looked at the effects of early intervention of preschool provision on children over time. And those children, I can't remember the exact figures now, but there were a number of children, mainly African Americans in absolute poor areas. Half of them were allocated to get free full-time preschool with qualified teachers for a year. The other half just carried on as normal. But they were in such poverty that the other half had to be given vitamin supplements, ethically, just to keep the thing going. They've been tracked for 40 years now. So the latest one now, it's people my age still being returned to, and they've kept that cohort together, and they're still showing positive effects of that early preschool intervention. My point, though, is that the context changed considerably now. So at that time, there wasn't universal preschool education in any form as it is today. That type of study is nearly irrelevant now in the UK because nearly every child gets preschool provision. Also, the type of comparison we're making with that trial has just moved on. You don't see that in industrialised societies. You don't have a control group like that anymore. I would be quite controversial. I'm not speaking on behalf of the Campbell collaboration now, just my own personal view, based on years of experience, nevertheless. But I would be less concerned about long-term effects. I think in education, probably half of what we do is ineffective. Children will develop because they just develop naturally. Of the trials that we've done, all the interventions we do on top of what they get in school, many of those seem to show no improvement compared to just carrying on as normal. So I think there's a bigger task for us just to identify those which are actually effective, that even give us a boost in the short term. And I think if you have a model of young people developing, which is a cumulative thing, that there's no silver bullet, you can't just do something at the age of 3 or 5 and that will give them universal change. If we understand that whatever boosts we can have needs to be carried on, it's not an excuse to have something at 3 to 5 years of age and then just do absolutely nothing and leave our young people to suffer afterwards. So in a sense, I'm not so concerned about long-term follow-up, and maybe that also answers the earlier question, that I'm not sure we need so many long-term follow-ups. What we do need urgently in education is to just look at, well, which programmes are actually having no effect at immediate post-test. Now, there is an argument, sorry, I'm hogging the thing, there is an argument that some programmes don't have effects initially, but they're slow-burning, the social-emotional learning programmes, that you may have no effects at immediate post-test, but the self-regulation that a child develops starts to show effects in terms of educational outcomes a few years hence. So there's going to be arguments for some longitudinal work, but I don't think we need as much as people may think.
Monsieur, nommez-vous, s'il vous plaît.
Michel Sedbon, sociologue. Je vais parler en français parce que c'est un peu compliqué, si vous permettez. Je crois que la question fondamentale que ces deux exposés brillants nous ont mis à jour, c'est pourquoi l'évidence-based, qu'elle soit médicale ou policy ou public health, ne marche pas, c'est-à-dire n'est pas appliquée malgré parfois la force de la preuve. Je crois que dans les deux exemples, mais surtout dans celui de la santé, l'évidence ne s'intéresse qu'à l'efficacité de l'acte et ne s'intéresse pas à l'ensemble du processus qui conduit de sa connaissance à son application. C'est-à-dire que l'introduction de nouveaux acteurs, que sont par exemple les médecins et les patients, ou les politiques quand il s'agit de décisions de santé publique, introduisent ou regardent la preuve qui leur est donnée. Je vais vous donner un exemple récent, celui de la pandémie grippale de 2009, où le programme qui était censé répondre à un risque majeur d'infection grippale dans la population a été la vaccination généralisée de la population française. Or, on ne s'est intéressé qu'à l'efficacité du vaccin, mais jamais à son acceptabilité et à la perception qu'en avait la population et les médecins pour le mettre en œuvre. Le résultat en a été que, alors qu'on s'attendait à une vaccination massive, on s'est retrouvé avec même pas 10% de la population qui s'est fait vacciner volontairement et qui allait à l'encontre de ce qu'on pouvait qualifier d'évidence, à savoir que le vaccin était le meilleur moyen protecteur de loin pour protéger la population. Donc, pour résumer, si j'ai une question adressée critique sur l'evidence-based, c'est de ne pas considérer l'ensemble du système dans lequel va s'appliquer ou cherche à s'appliquer cette évidence pour ne se centrer que sur le produit lui-même.
Ravaud peut-il répondre? Ah, j'entends, moi je peux répondre.
Moi je peux répondre parce que j'ai beaucoup réfléchi à ce problème. Je pense qu'il ne faut pas mélanger, il y a deux choses différentes. L'efficacité de la stratégie, elle est évidente. Et je veux dire, dans le cas particulier, on a beaucoup réfléchi à ça et on va encore y réfléchir. Il n'y a pas de problème. Le problème, c'est que le gouvernement, il faut bien le nommer, dans le cas particulier, le ministère de la Santé et la Direction générale de la Santé n'ont pas utilisé les données factuelles de façon adéquate. Ils ont fait des erreurs énormes dans l'application de la mesure qui avait été décidée et qui a conduit à ce doute qui persiste dans l'esprit des Français sur les vaccinations. Et cette année, alors cette année c'est un peu compliqué parce que le vaccin n'était pas totalement efficace. Mais il y a eu, depuis, en tout cas indépendamment de ce problème d'efficacité du vaccin, il y a eu une perte de confiance dans les vaccins qui est considérable. Mais ce n'est pas dû à l'analyse des faits, ce n'est pas dû à de l'évidence, comme on disait. C'est dû au fait simplement que si les faits, l'analyse des faits n'est pas accompagnée d'une communication adéquate, étant donné l'obscurantisme ambiant qui existe dans les pays développés, en particulier en France, les gens se posent des questions dans un contexte où ils ne tiennent pas compte justement de l'évidence de la preuve. Et les gens, parce que ce qui est terrible, c'est pas seulement vrai au niveau de la population générale. Moi, j'ai bien vu que même des médecins, y compris des médecins pédiatres, se posaient ces questions. Et ils se posaient ces questions par ignorance. C'est de l'ignorance. J'ose utiliser le terme d'obscurantisme. Je suis désolé d'être un peu aussi fort que cela. Alors maintenant, en tant que sociologue, vous pouvez réfléchir, et c'est utile, à savoir, et d'autres le font, il y a des sociologues qui l'ont fait très bien d'ailleurs, pourquoi y a-t-il cette résistance à des faits incontestables, quelles sont les raisons sociétales ou autres, ça c'est un vrai sujet, mais je pense qu'il ne faut pas confondre la mise en évidence des preuves et après leur mauvaise application par les décideurs ou le mauvais environnement médiatique qui pousse les gens à dire des choses qui ne sont pas exactes.